The hardest part of love is learning to wait when every part of you wants to run. Clara was not a woman of many words. She didn't need to be. Her presence spoke for her, quiet, steady, like the sunrise. She lived in a modest home on the edge of a small town, where everyone knew each other's names, and unfortunately, each other's business. Her son Daniel was 19 when his life was torn apart. One rainy evening, a crime shook the town. A store was robbed, and the owner injured. The police, eager to close the case, pointed the finger at Daniel, simply because he was nearby, simply because he fit the description. In a single night, Clara's world shifted. The boy she had raised with love and discipline was branded a criminal. Friends stopped visiting. Church pews felt colder. People avoided her eyes at the market. Even relatives whispered that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was guilty. But Clara knew her son. She knew the honesty in his eyes, and she made a quiet promise too. I will wait until the truth has a voice. Patience, people thought, was just sitting still, but Clara's patience was alive. Every morning before sunrise, she brewed her tea, sat by the wooden kitchen table, and wrote letters. Letters to lawyers, letters to newspapers, letters to anyone who might listen. She attended every hearing. She never shouted at the judge, never cursed the police. She sat in the same seat, hands folded in her lap, her presence a constant reminder. I am not giving up. Years passed. Seasons changed. New families moved into town. People forgot about Daniel. But every night, Clara kept his room clean, as if he might walk through the door at any moment. She ironed his shirts, kept his books dusted, and placed fresh flowers on his windowsill. 9 years later, a young attorney stumbled upon Daniel's case. Something felt wrong. He dug deeper and found new evidence, evidence that proved Daniel's innocence. The day the verdict was overturned, Daniel walked out of the courthouse and into his mother's arms. Clara held him the same way she did when he was a child, firm, unshakable, as if she could protect him from the world by sheer will. When reporters swarmed her, asking, "How did you do it? How did you wait for so long?" she simply smiled and said, "Patience isn't just waiting. It's how you live while you wait." Closing moral: patience is not passive. It's strength in slow motion. It's the courage to believe in the light when you're standing in the longest night of your life. In a world where shortcuts are tempting, the long road of honesty is the one few dare to walk. There's a narrow street in the heart of the old city, where the air always smells faintly of spices and warm bread. On that street stands a small shop, wooden shelves, glass jars of candy, sacks of rice stacked in the corner. And behind the counter, year after year, stood Mr. Ibrahim. He was not a rich man. His shop was modest, his clothes simple. But his reputation was worth more than gold. Everyone in the neighborhood knew, if you bought something from Mr. Ibrahim, you got exactly what you paid for. Not a gram more, not a gram less. One summer, a big supermarket opened nearby. Shiny aisles, blinding lights, discounts plastered in red ink. The city flocked there. Many small shops closed within months. Friends urged Mr. Ibrahim to adapt, to cut corners, to mix cheaper grains into the rice, to overcharge tourists who wouldn't know the difference. He refused. "If my hands are not clean, my bread will not feed me," he would say quietly. The struggle grew. Days passed when he barely made enough to cover rent. One evening, a wealthy businessman walked in and offered him a deal: sell him expired goods at a high price for resale elsewhere. "No one will find out," the man promised, smiling. Mr. Ibrahim looked him in the eye and said, "My father taught me that every coin earned dishonestly carries a curse. I cannot afford that kind of debt. The businessman left, annoyed. And so, Mr. Ibrahim's struggle continued. Months later, a heavy flood hit the city. Roads were blocked, shops were destroyed, and the supermarket shelves emptied in 2 days. But Mr. Ibrahim's little shop, on slightly higher ground, remained standing. People lined up outside, hungry, desperate. And though he could have doubled his prices and grown rich overnight, he didn't. He sold at the same price as before, sometimes less, and gave away food to those who couldn't pay. News spread quickly. Neighbors who had once abandoned his store returned, this time with gratitude. They didn't just buy from him, they trusted him. The supermarket recovered eventually, but it never regained the loyalty Mr. Ibrahim now had. Years later, when he was asked how he survived those hard times, he said, "Honesty is slow to grow, but once it takes root, no storm can pull it out." True generosity is not giving what you have left over. It's giving when you have almost nothing left at all. In a sun-baked village where the earth cracked under the weight of months without rain, people had stopped talking about the weather because talking didn't bring the clouds. Wells had dried, fields had turned to dust, and the once green horizon was now the color of old parchment. Among the villagers was a farmer named Miguel. His land wasn't large, just a few acres. He had planted his crops months before the drought began, praying the rains would come in time. They didn't. But somehow, by a miracle or a stubborn twist of fate, a small patch of his field survived. Enough to fill a few sacks with grain. It wasn't much. In fact, it was barely enough to feed his own family until the next season. His wife, Maria, begged him to store it away. "We must think of the children," she said, her voice trembling. But Miguel saw the hollow eyes of his neighbors. The way children walked slower now, their bodies weak. The way proud men had begun standing in silent lines outside the village well, hoping for drops that never came. One morning, without a word, Miguel loaded his grain onto a cart and began delivering it, sack by sack, to every home in the village. Some refused at first, embarrassed. Others wept as they accepted it. One man asked him, "Why are you giving this away when your own family could need it?" Miguel's answer was simple. Hunger is not a burden we should carry alone. The grain lasted only a few weeks, but those weeks were enough to keep the weakest alive until help arrived from outside the region. When the rains finally returned the next year, the entire village came together to help Miguel replant his fields. Neighbors worked side by side, repairing his fences, sowing his seeds, even bringing him extra tools. His harvest that year was larger than any he had seen before, because when the community thrives, so does the individual. Years later, people still told the story of the farmer who fed strangers in the worst of times. Not because he had much, but because he gave anyway. Closing moral: the measure of generosity is not in what you give, but in what you are willing to go without, so another can survive. Sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who refuses to give up on you, even when you're given up on yourself. In the back corner of room 12, there sat a boy named Alex. He didn't talk much. He didn't hand in homework. Most days, his head rested on the desk, eyes fixed on the clock. Teachers had learned to ignore him, convinced he was a lost cause. But not Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She had been teaching for over 20 years, and she knew that every student carried a story. Some stories were loud and obvious. Others were locked away behind silence. One rainy afternoon, she asked Alex to stay after class. He didn't look up. "I just need 5 minutes," she said. When the room emptied, she sat across from him and asked softly, "Alex, what happened?" At first, he shrugged. Then, slowly, words spilled out. His father had left when he was 10. His mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home. He often skipped school to take care of his younger sister. Homework, grades, tests, none of it seemed important when there were bills to pay and an empty fridge to fill. Mrs. Carter listened. Not to respond, not to lecture, just to listen. And then she said something that would stay with Alex for the rest of his life. You are not your circumstances. You are your choices. And I believe you can choose differently. From that day forward, she started giving him small tasks. Not overwhelming assignments, just enough to rebuild his trust in himself. She helped him study after school, found him part-time work through a friend, and even brought groceries to his home when no one was looking. There were setbacks, days he didn't show up, tests he failed, but Mrs. Carter never used the word failure. She only said, "Not yet." By the end of the year, Alex wasn't just passing. He was one of the top students in the class. A few years later, he graduated high school and earned a scholarship to college. On graduation day, he handed Mrs. Carter a letter that read, "You saw a future for me when I couldn't see past tomorrow. That's what saved me." Closing moral: sometimes wisdom isn't found in grand speeches or complex lessons. It's found in the quiet, unwavering belief that no one is beyond hope. You don't have to know someone to save their life. You just have to care enough not to walk away. The rain began as a soft drizzle that afternoon, harmless, almost gentle. But by nightfall, the wind had turned violent, and the sky roared like an angry sea. The town's warning sirens wailed, urging people indoors. Streets became rivers, and the air was filled with the sound of rushing water and snapping branches. Ethan was driving home from work when he saw it. A small car stranded on the side of the road, half submerged in water. Most drivers passed by, eager to get home before the storm grew worse. But something in Ethan's chest wouldn't let him. He pulled over. Inside the car was a young woman, terrified, clutching the steering wheel. The water was rising fast, seeping in through the doors. "Come on," he shouted through the wind, wading toward her. She shook her head, frozen in fear. That's when Ethan did something reckless. He opened the door and pulled her out, the icy water pushing hard against them. Step by step, he fought the current, guiding her toward the higher ground of an old brick gas station nearby. Inside, they found a few other storm-stranded strangers. The group huddled together as the storm raged outside, sharing what little food and dry clothing they had. Ethan checked on the young woman often, making sure she was warm. When the rain finally eased in the early morning hours, rescue crews arrived. The young woman asked Ethan for his number, desperate to repay him somehow. He smiled and shook his head. "I didn't do it for a thank you," he said. "I just hope that when you see someone else in trouble, you stop too." They never met again, but she told the story for years of the stranger who appeared in the storm and vanished when the sun returned. Closing moral: kindness doesn't need a name. Sometimes the greatest acts of wisdom come from those who will never ask for recognition, only the hope that their act will be passed on. Success means nothing if you lose yourself on the way to getting it. David had worked at the manufacturing plant for 8 years. He wasn't the loudest or the most ambitious, but his work was always precise, and his word could be trusted. He believed that how you do something is just as important as what you achieve. One Friday afternoon, his manager called him into the office. "David, we're considering you for a supervisor position," the manager said. It was the promotion David had been quietly hoping for. More pay, more security for his family. But then came the catch. "There's an audit next week," the manager continued, lowering his voice. "Some of our reports aren't exactly in order. All you need to do is sign off on them as they are, no questions. If you can do that, the promotion is yours." David's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. He'd be signing off on false numbers, hiding mistakes that could hurt the company's workers and possibly even its customers. All weekend, he wrestled with it. He imagined his wife's relief if he got the promotion, He pictured paying off debts, finally fixing the leaking roof. But every time he tried to convince himself, he remembered something his father used to say. A dishonest man can be rich in his wallet and bankrupt in his soul. On Monday, David walked into the office and slid the unsigned papers back to his manager. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't sign this. My name is the one thing I can't afford to sell." The promotion went to someone else. David stayed at his old position, doing the same work for the same pay. But something unexpected happened. Months later, the truth about the reports came out. And the manager who had pushed him was quietly removed. When the company needed someone steady, someone trustworthy to help rebuild the department's reputation, they turned to David. This time, the offer came with no conditions, just the recognition that he was the kind of leader they needed. Closing moral: integrity may delay your rise, but it makes sure you can stand tall when you get there. Wisdom isn't always in having the right words. Sometimes it's in knowing when to say nothing at all. Every evening, at the edge of the park, an old man named Walter sat on a weathered wooden bench. His coat was always neatly buttoned, his shoes shined, and his eyes soft, the kind of eyes that made people feel safe. Walter didn't talk much. He'd nod politely when greeted, but rarely spoke first. And yet, strangely, people often ended up sitting beside him, telling him things they hadn't told anyone. There was the young mother, exhausted from caring for a newborn, who sat down one afternoon and poured out her fears of not being good enough. Walter listened. Not once did he interrupt. When she was done, she found her own voice trembling less, her heart feeling lighter. Though Walter had said nothing more than, "I understand." Then there was the teenage boy, angry at the world, who told Walter about his fights at school and how no one understood him. Walter just sat there, letting the boy's words spill into the open air. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the boy had stopped frowning. It wasn't that Walter didn't have stories to tell. He had lived through war, loss, love, and change. But somewhere along the way, he had learned that most people don't need your advice. They need your ears. One day, a man who had often passed Walter without stopping finally sat beside him. "Why do you never talk much?" he asked. Walter smiled gently. "When I was younger, I spoke because I wanted to be heard. Now I listen because I want others to be heard." Over time, the bench became a quiet sanctuary in the park, a place where people knew they could sit, speak their hearts, and be met with silence that understood more than words ever could. Closing moral: listening is a gift that costs nothing, but can heal more than the finest words ever spoken. Sometimes the most powerful comfort isn't found in words, but in the quiet presence of someone who refuses to let go. It was the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. The corridors were dim, lit only by the soft glow of ceiling lights, and the hum of machines filled the air. In room 406 lay Mr. Harris, an elderly man in his final hours. His family lived far away, and the doctors knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Nurse Claire had seen many goodbyes in her years of work, but something about Mr. Harris's loneliness that night stirred something deep in her. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed. She could have finished her rounds and left the machines to do their work, but instead, she pulled up a chair beside his bed and took his hand. At first, she spoke softly about the weather, about the sunrise he wouldn't see, about the kindness of strangers. But soon, she stopped talking. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she realized she didn't need to say anything at all. The warmth of her hand in his was enough. Minutes turned to hours. The monitors beeped steadily, then slower still. At one point, Mr. Harris opened his eyes and looked at her, not with fear, but with a calm acceptance. And in that gaze was something unspoken. "Thank you for not letting me leave this world alone." When his breathing finally stopped, Claire stayed a little longer, still holding his hand. She didn't cry. She didn't rush away. She simply sat in the silence, honoring a life that had quietly ended, as if keeping him company on his final journey. When the other nurses asked why she stayed so long, she said, because when words have nothing left to give, presence still can. Closing moral? Sometimes the deepest form of wisdom is knowing that love is not always spoken. It is felt, in the moments when we choose to simply be there. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It releases you from being its prisoner. Liam and Eric had been inseparable since childhood. They shared secrets, dreams, and the kind of loyalty that made people say, those two will be friends for life. But trust, like glass, can shatter in a moment. One year, when Liam was going through his hardest season, his mother ill, his job hanging by a thread, he discovered that Eric had betrayed him in the worst way. A business opportunity Liam had been working on for months was stolen right from under him, and Eric was the one who had taken it. The truth came out in a storm of anger. Liam felt as if the ground had been ripped from beneath him. The man he called his brother had turned his back on him for money. They stopped speaking. Weeks became months. The bitterness hardened inside Liam like stone. Then one winter afternoon, Liam's phone rang. It was Eric. His voice was different, quieter, worn. He had lost everything. The deal he stole had collapsed. His finances had crumbled and his health was failing. I don't deserve to ask, Eric said, but I need help. Liam could have hung up. Every part of him had a right to. But that night, he lay awake thinking about all the years before the betrayal, the laughter, the support, the way they'd once stood by each other through thick and thin. The next day, he drove to Eric's small apartment. Eric opened the door, thin and pale. Without a word, Liam stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace. It wasn't warm, not yet. It was awkward, heavy with unspoken pain, but it was a start. Over time, Liam helped Eric get back on his feet. They never went back to the way things were, but they built something new. A friendship that carried scars, but also the quiet strength that comes from surviving the fire together. When asked why he forgave, Liam simply said, because carrying hate was heavier than carrying him. Closing moral. Forgiving doesn't mean you condone what happened. It means you choose freedom over the weight of anger. And sometimes, that freedom is the greatest gift you can give yourself. You never know when the smallest act of kindness will become someone's lifeline. It was just after sunrise when Samir started his shift. His taxi was old but clean, the kind of car that smelled faintly of coffee and worn leather. For years, he had driven the same streets, picking up passengers from all walks of life. Business people rushing to meetings, students late for class, tourists trying to find their way. But Samir wasn't like other drivers. To him, his taxi wasn't just a way to make a living. It was a moving, safe space. He greeted every passenger with a warm smile, kept a small box of tissues in the glove compartment, a bottle of water in the back seat, and a playlist of gentle music for those who needed quiet company. One rainy evening, a young man climbed into the back. He gave Samir an address, but kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Halfway through the ride, Samir noticed the man was quietly crying. He didn't pry, but when they stopped at a red light, he turned down the music and said softly, I don't know what you're going through, but I hope you remember, storms don't last forever. The young man didn't reply, but when they reached the destination, he paused before getting out. Thank you, he whispered. I was thinking of ending everything tonight, but maybe I'll wait. Samir never saw him again, but he never forgot that moment. Over the years, there were other small encounters. The elderly woman he drove to her husband's grave every Sunday. The single mother he picked up after every night shift without charging her when she was short on cash. The tourist who lost her wallet and left his cab with more hope than she had before. Samir never asked for tips or thanks. He simply believed that if the world was a little kinder inside his taxi, maybe that kindness would spill out onto the streets. One day, when his car finally gave out after decades of service, a group of regular passengers pooled their money to buy him another one. It wasn't just a car. It was a moving testament to the lives he had touched without even realizing. When asked why he did it, Samir shrugged with a smile. Because you never know if the person in your back seat needs a ride or a reason to keep going. Closing moral: every interaction is an opportunity to leave someone better than you found them. And sometimes, the smallest kindness can echo longer than you'll ever know.